BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. And the first thing to say, as always, if you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, at the end, please drop some comments below so we can continue the discussion. And this show now has an Instagram page, BlackBoxNed88. One more time, BlackBoxNed88. And if you follow the show on Instagram, you'll get access to a special bonus podcast where we talk about music, movies, daily life, and more. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. Now, I've said a few times on the channel that I have this kind of weird hobby where I listen to old radio reports from some of the previous years, and I was listening to an episode of WCR from 2010, and they're talking a lot about the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who was Barack Obama's first Secretary of Defense. And I mean, I just want to say that maybe, just maybe, this weird hobby that I have of listening to old radio shows might actually pay off in some way in terms of connecting a few dots, allowing us to have somewhat of a greater understanding of how things function. Because you might be thinking about the New World Order, the deep state, the shadow government. Are these things real? Or when people use those terms, New World Order, shadow government, and deep state, what do they really mean? And what does this have to do with Robert Gates? Well, a lot of people were horribly critical of Barack Obama for choosing Robert Gates because he was somebody from the Bush era. And even Sean Hannity on primetime television said that that was one of the few things that he would praise Barack Obama for, choosing Robert Gates as Secretary of Defense, who was from the Bush cabinet. But a lot of people are just like, hey, wait a second. This is just the same inner workings of some type of already pre-established order, if you will. And that's what you really seem to find out when you investigate the government, whether it's Republican or Democrat. It comes back to the concept of there is just one side. And some people would call that the New World Order. Some people call that the functioning of the deep state or the shadow government. But what we can say is there are alliances. There is corruption. And people use corruption as a way to make these alliances stronger. Because the reason why they're talking about Robert Gates is they're saying that he comes from the Zbigniew-Brzezinski school of thought, and that Brzezinski very famously comes from the Rockefellers. And we can tie him into David Rockefeller the same way that you can connect Henry Kissinger to Nelson Rockefeller. I mean, this stuff is clear as day. It's published out in the open. That stuff isn't any wacky conspiracies. And if you ever get a chance to read Richard Norton Smith's biography on Nelson Rockefeller, it talks about how he openly said in one of the promotions for the book that Nelson Rockefeller's greatest find was Henry Kissinger. So the Rockefellers are connected to Kissinger and Brzezinski. And then after Brzezinski, we get to Robert Gates. And then Robert Gates is somebody, before you just think well, where are you going with all this? There's a group called the CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. I get on their website rather frequently, and I saw that they are actually a promoter of the Brzezinski Institute for Geostrategy. And this is something that just goes to show you that the Brzezinski Institute for Geostrategy is promoting what? The message of the Rockefellers. Who did they give the inaugural Brzezinski Prize to? They have this thing, it's called the inaugural Brzezinski Prize, and then the second Brzezinski Prize for accomplishments and activity that benefits their agenda, they gave it to Robert Gates. So Robert Gates is definitely from the Brzezinski school of thought. And then the second person who got the second Brzezinski Prize in 2017, Robert Gates was the first in 2016. In 2017, Joe Biden. Can you believe that? This is all published online. CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. There was a member of the CSIS who was the director of something called the Transnational Threats Project. His name was Arno de Borgrov, and I've been following him a lot over the past 3 years. I mean, he has passed away, but I've been following the media that he has put out. And Arno de Borgrov was someone who worked with the Washington Times, he worked with Newsweek, and he was also one of the founders of Newsmax, very instrumental in the founding of Newsmax. Now, Arno de Borgrov is someone who is, people really would be very critical of him. They were trying to say that he was representing the Belgian royal family, that he was a KGB agent back in the 1980s. those things get thrown around a lot. There are lots of accusations. Many people were accused of being KGB agents all up and down the spectrum. But what we can say is they got this group that was instrumental in the founding of Newsmax, as well as supporting the politicians that were connected to Brzezinski, who's connected to the Rockefellers. The alliances exist. This isn't just wacky ramblings. You can read the stuff for yourselves, and it's clear as day. And all the people who are talking about the Council on Foreign Relations, I mean, if you read up on that stuff, who's behind that? Kissinger and Associates, which once again comes back to the agenda set forth by the Rockefellers. It's like, this is not crazy. And it really is rather simple when you think about it. Corruption exists. And even in the Western world, corruption does not disappear. As people use corruption as a way to strengthen the alliances among the few. Who are the few? The oligarchs. Corruption becomes one of the means that people use to allow oligarchy to propagate, and that, in short, gives us the definition of the New World Order. So it's not some absolutely disgusting, all hyped up conspiracy theory. No, it just means that there are a lot of disgusting people in the world who don't have moral compasses, and they will do anything to get power. So that's kind of where we are right now. And to expand upon some of the things that I would say that are not clear as day, that you can't just necessarily pull up on Google.com. Everything I told you up until now, it's all clear as day. These alliances between Brzezinski and the Rockefellers, and then Newsmax coming back to the CSIS, which can go back to Brzezinski, back to the Rockefellers. That's all available online. But what you can see in some, maybe a little bit more conspiratorial, is that Obama himself was promoted by who? Zbigniew Brzezinski. And yes, Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows who he is. Carter's national security advisor in 1976, as well as carrying on the tradition, because when someone is national security advisor, they don't just disappear. I mean, Brzezinski talked about this very clearly when he would say that he is he's attending meetings with other national security advisors, or the people who are currently in the White House would call him for conferences and such. The national security advisor does not disappear. Condoleezza Rice was instrumental in multiple decisions in the Trump cabinet, particularly the choice of Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. These people just don't just vanish. All right, my 4 years is up and I'm never going to be heard from again. And a bigger example than Brzezinski or Rice is Henry Kissinger, who went on to work, not only become Secretary of State, of course, but also Kissinger and Associates. And one of the theories is that Kissinger is the single most powerful person in the world, even up into his 90s. Is that really true? That's one of those things that, I mean, people talk about it. I can't give you hard proof of that right now, but he is the most powerful person in the world because of his ability to have influence over foreign governments. Another example of something that maybe we can't substantiate immediately, but that Barack Obama and Zbigniew Brzezinski had a meeting at Occidental College when Obama was a student there. And that was the reason why Obama transferred from Occidental to Columbia and moving to New York and all of that, is that he was groomed for the presidency by Zbigniew Brzezinski. And because, well, once again, to have a Rockefeller deep state plant in the White House. And there are countless theories that go on with Barack Obama and where he came from. All I can say is not all of them can be true, but people do talk about that Barack Obama was heavily supported by Brzezinski and, in turn, the Rockefellers. This runs so much deeper than just these people that we've mentioned, talking about Brzezinski and Kissinger and Obama and Robert Gates and Arnaud de Bourgrave. And Arnaud de Bourgrave is a fascinating person, mind you. Someone who was a member of the Belgian royal family, escaped during World War II, and then made his way to America, and then got started in journalism, renounced his royal family connections in 1951. But, I mean, there's something so much bigger here. I was just listening to a podcast today that was talking about the Sykes-Picot Treaty after World War I. And they didn't mention this, but of course there's also the Balfour Declaration after, the First World War. Actually, I think the Balfour Declaration was first, what was that, 1917, was it? So maybe the war was still going on, the planning for the nation-state of Israel, and that I had heard of. But then the Sykes-Picot Treaty was a secret treaty that was all about establishing borders and lines in the sand, if you will, in the Middle East for the nations of Iraq and Syria. And the whole point with both of those things is that there are going to be new divisions in the Middle East, and it's pretty much just carved up. And one of the things that people are proposing with this is that it's to keep the wars going. Look what we got going on in Iraq and Syria, even to this day. Look at the conflict we're still having, Palestine and Israel, that all of this stuff was pre-planned as a way to keep a large portion of the world divided, as well as fueling the wars, because war can be very profitable, or as well as just the concept that if the world is fighting, then the global elites can still extend their power structure, then they can still use corruption to allow their oligarchy to propagate. Oligarchy is a very real concept. And I really have to confess to you, I'm not some massive expert on World War I. I am not a historian. I was just listening to one show about the Sykes-Picot Treaty, but that is something that falls in line as a consistent piece with the narrative that we've been talking about. People are using certain actions and they're abusing power to allow oligarchy to propagate. Corruption takes place in a variety of forms, but it really expands upon a point that, it's the first time that I've heard it laid out exactly like this, that World War I never ended. That's what they're talking about when they're dealing with these borders in the Middle East about Iraq and Syria. And from time to time, you will hear political commentators bring this up during the discussions on Palestine and Israel, and they're saying, now, hey, wait a second, these nations aren't very old. There was no nation, before 1917 and such. You will hear people say things like that during the conversations about Palestine and Israel. It was the first time that I heard it about Iraq and Syria. And that very specifically, Iraq was designed as a way to keep the nation constantly at war because, well, look what they talk about with Iraq. Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds. That the north is, controlled by the Kurds, and then you have the Sunnis and the Shia in the south. It's like, and remember in the war in Iraq, they would divide the map into 3 different sections. That stuff we are all familiar with, anyone who grew up during the war in Iraq. So you can see that maybe there is a certain degree of truth to that they would want to keep this part of the world always at war, perhaps for oil rights, as well as just having more power over a large portion of the world and always having something that they can defer to keep the voting masses distracted in the Western world. But on that note, one of the things that I hear very rarely talked about is a city called Birobidzhan. It's in Russia. I was looking at a map once of Russia, and I saw the word Jewish just written in the Russian Far East, and I was like, what on earth is that? Jewish? So I did some Googling about it, and Russia has an oblast called the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, and its capital is Birobidzhan. This city was I thought it was founded in 1915, if I recall reading from that stuff 10 years ago, but I was looking it up earlier today, and it was saying that it was founded in 1931, and Stalin was heavily praised for finding a place for the Jews in the Soviet Union, if you will. But in short, like, I read this stuff a long time ago, but I swear this is what I read, that it's just he thought that the only place that the Jews could exist would be in a swamp on the edge of Siberia. So it was actually a rather discriminatory move, and he wanted to do that to counter the future plans for the nation state of Israel. I've never heard anybody ever talk about Birobidzhan. I went to Russia. I met people from Khabarovsk, and I met people from Vladivostok, but I never met anyone from Birobidzhan or even heard anybody talk about this ever. But, you can read about it right online, and they actually made a documentary about him. I think it was called Spasiba, Comrade Stalin, like, thank you, Comrade Stalin. It's a documentary about the city of Birobidzhan and the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. And the whole point is, global elites are trying to micromanage the situation around the world, making specific and calculated decisions to get a desired outcome in the geopolitical course. But we also have to always pay attention to the fact that they have their alliances. That is not a crazy conspiracy, and that's not a far-out wacky idea. Politicians have alliances. We talk about this all the time with one party, like, oh yeah, these Republicans are actually all on the same side. Oh, these Democrats are actually on the same side, the Blue Dog Democrats and the Puma Democrats. Oh yeah, they have their own alliances. All of them do. Because power is something that many people want. And large concentrations of wealth equal large concentrations of power. And you can really see, though, that now, it's not necessarily to say that someone like the president is powerless, but what I've really noticed is to get into the presidency, a person has to cut a lot of ties with things that they believe in and make ties with the existing power structure, in short, becoming absorbed into the oligarchy. When Donald Trump rose to power, everybody just said the deep state was going wild, the British Empire was going wild. They said all of these things. And, I was very skeptical of that, but really, you can sort of, I guess I can comprehend it a little bit more once we sort of lay it all out like this, that he was not someone who was handpicked and chosen by the existing power structure. But what you can say is that these connections do exist. Everything that we laid out with Obama and Robert Gates and George Bush and Obama choosing the same Secretary of Defense who is connected to Brzezinski, who is connected to the Rockefellers, and it's not just simply that, he's connected, that he had a meeting with him once. I mean, if he comes from that school of thought and was given the Zbigniew Brzezinski Prize from the CSIS, Brzezinski Institute on Geostrategy in 2016, that's a little bit more than just a friendly encounter. I mean, he was definitely coming from that background, and that type of power structure remained in place. So then what you can see is that Barack Obama was just a continuation of that. Right now it is 2020, and what we can say is, did World War I ever end? I don't know. People also say the Civil War never ended in America, and in June of 2020, I'm definitely believing that to a certain extent. World War I, World War II, we are always constantly at war. That's all I can really say. But where do the alliances live? And I think that's where we're going to have to leave it for now. If you have anything to say at all about any of this stuff, and if you want to comment more about the New World Order and the Deep State, and I'll include a link to one of our previous uploads on the New World Order, sharing some additional information and perspectives, I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Please drop a comment below. And if you think that anything that I said is crazy about how people in power form alliances so that they can get into power and stay into power, I mean, that's not an outrageous statement. And as horrible as it is to say, one person who was actually really good at that was Jeffrey Epstein, penetrating the circles of oligarchy. But now, well, he's dead, and good riddance to him. He was a terrible person, but he did manipulate many different oligarchs. Now, I think we're going to have to leave it there for now. Once again, please drop some comments below. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And I will see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.